On this edition of Best of Both Worlds Studios, we're going to look at a conspiracy theory that's gaining traction and that is of interest and concern both in the United States and Australia. I'm talking about QAnon. And to discuss that, we're joined by Audrey Cordy, who's a lecturer at Griffin University in Brisbane, Australia, and also by Ted O'Connor, who's a producer for Australian Broadcasting Corporation's ABC News Breakfast. Audrey, first, welcome to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
I wanted to start, for those who really want to have an understanding of what QAnon is, how would you define QAnon?
So the QAnon phenomenon started off as a series of baseless conspiracy theories. In essence, the theory is that there is this global network of elites. This includes politicians, Hollywood celebrities, media, that have a plot to take down Trump. Depending on who is spreading these theories, one of the main claims is that this global elite are also guilty of having a child sex trafficking ring. So it started off as a conspiracy theory about a plot against Trump to take him down, and it's evolved into a meta-narrative of good and evil, of Trump being this hero that's trying to combat this child sex trafficking ring. And further still, it's evolved into now what I would call a QAnon movement, where it's co-opting all these new ideas and people, and it's really hard to say now what QAnon really is.
And to that point, Ted, I know that you were interested in finding out how easy it is to fall into QAnon, if you will. You began an investigation, didn't you, into this?
What sparked my interest was Twitter's announcement, and the way it was reported with every headline is Twitter was cracking down on QAnon. And I looked at what Twitter said, and it seemed quite vague. I wanted to understand more about what this actual crackdown would look like. So, as well as talking to experts, I wanted to get a bit of my own personal experience so I could give them some good examples. So I started trying to follow a few Q pages, and at the start, I was only given up articles from Twitter, from reputable news websites, basically describing QAnon as a conspiracy theory. So I thought, so far, that's what Twitter's intention is. But then using the hashtag, I delved deeper. I ended up finding a few QAnon pages to follow, American ones with hundreds of thousands of followers. And quite quickly, these tweets from these posts would start propping up in my feed. They would be amplified on days when Trump was tweeting a lot. And then in Twitter's site recommendation sidebar, I was recommended QAnon followers to follow. Sorry, QAnon posters to follow. And I thought, it didn't really look like a crackdown to me, but I didn't consider myself a social media expert. So I went to people like Audrey and two other two other people who are professors in social media. And they said what I was seeing was very unsurprising. And that's because it's more of like a ring fencing than an actual crackdown. They're basically trying to go after perhaps the worst of it. And as one social media professor said, it's keeping it all in one place. So even if there's a huge amount of QAnon traffic, if it stays in one place and doesn't get out to the wider network, then that's sort of what more Twitter are going for. But I just found it interesting. So many people I talked to saw that headline and assumed when Twitter's cracking down, they're really going after QAnon, but perhaps they aren't.
Do you think it's that they aren't, Ted? And I'd like to bring you into this too, Audrey, or do you think it's really difficult to do this? I mean, you went out with kind of a try before you buy, and the next thing you know, you're in the checkout line for QAnon. I mean, how is it that they're not doing their job, or is it that it's really hard?
I think Twitter is doing their job. Like Audrey, Axel Bruns and Timothy Baldwin all said it's not like Twitter's not trying. I think they're only working within a framework that they can actually work with, which is basically a ring fencing, basically trying to contain QAnon. But I think the word crackdown, or I used someone, I was asked in a radio interview, do you think they're eradicating them? And I think definitely not.
Audrey, let's bring you in at that point, because I know Ted interviewed you for this article and you've been studying QAnon a lot. Why is QAnon gaining traction in Australia?
I think QAnon, so recently with the lockdowns and the pandemic, QAnon has popularity has really skyrocketed because it's a time of insecurity and instability. I think also people had a lot more free time on their hands. And I think we're going through this sense-making process of what is happening to us and why is it happening to us? And for a lot of people, in looking for explanations, they have come across conspiracy theories being peddled by QAnon. And one of QAnon's more recent strategies is to appeal to a more mainstream audience. What they're doing is they're constantly co-opting new movements, new ideas. So what makes it really different and unique compared to other popular conspiracy theories like 9/11 or JFK is that QAnon's conspiracy theories are not stuck in the past.
QAnon at one point had this relatively narrow definition.
Yes.
And now it seems to have morphed.
Yes, so what QAnon is doing differently than other conspiracy theories or movements is they're constantly concocting and manufacturing new claims about things that are constantly happening on a daily basis. So the coronavirus was a great example of this. What started out as a theory about a global network of elites trying to take down Trump started peddling new claims about coronavirus. So some of these included the fact that the coronavirus was a hoax. Others was that it was a Chinese bioweapon. A third one that they've pushed as well was that 5G towers were causing the coronavirus. So a lot of these claims, this is how they stay relevant, and this is how they appeal to a more mainstream audience.
How do you navigate that, particularly at a time when everybody's at home, everybody's online, and suddenly there's a lot more opportunity for people to accidentally dabble in this world?
Yes, I mean, it's really hard parsing through these things. And this is how they draw you in. You know, you'll be like, oh, I agree with this. So there'll be elements of truth. And you agree with these things. You sympathize with some of the causes. And then they draw you into the rest of their, you know, kind of, I mean, Ted calls these tentacles, but they draw you into this wider QAnon universe. And it's actually really hard to distinguish between these things, especially for the average person who might not have a lot of knowledge about these issues. And I think what's very seductive about conspiracy theories and what makes it so difficult to counter them is that they're self-sealing. And what I mean by this is that any evidence that contradicts the conspiracy theory is seen as evidence of the theory itself. So because a lot of conspiracy theorists think that there's that the people that are in on this conspiracy, on this plot, have unusual and extensive powers, any attempt to counter their claims is seen as evidence that these people are in on this plot. So this is what really makes it challenging to counter conspiracy theories. And we see this with Twitter's crackdown. As soon as they started cracking down on QAnon pages, you could already see the comments and responses. There were people saying, you know, look no further, this is evidence that Twitter, you know, is part of this elite scheme to hide the truth.
Ted, you started out looking at where the tentacles of QAnon spread to. Did you wind up getting caught in the tentacles that you were looking at, seeing how far they extended?
Well, it was amazing how quite a few deep clicks you could go. So to give you an example with one QAnon user that I followed, this was a guy who had 300,000 followers. He had his own YouTube page. What he had was quite a slick operation. He sold mugs, he sold t-shirts. It was clearly a full-time job for him. There was clearly money in it. But if you listen to his YouTube account, there was some completely crazy stuff about like CIA mind control. Some of his tangents would get like quite offensive. Like I could not repeat the things, you know, he was saying on here. So but he also had like a secondary sort of his own investigations YouTube channel, and there was actually, the production values of it were quite high. So I just found it interesting. This guy he wasn't among Twitter's 7,000 users that they've got rid of. So he's survived to this point. And I think one of the reasons he survived is in the last 3 months, he hasn't used Q or QAnon in his actual Twitter posts. He's been more careful to keep it to his YouTube accounts. So it just I thought it was interesting. If this guy's like, to me, seemed almost quite prominent, and he has escaped Twitter's wrath, you know, how many others? What were the ones like that they've shut down? And I think that's what was so sad for me is the money in it. He clearly had an audience. They were clearly giving him money, and he was just feeding them the most vile you know, terrifying stuff. And like, as a journalist, as someone who's done investigations, you know, I go through such rigorous processes with fact checking. Even for this article, you know, we did a line by line fact check on it. We looked at, you know, the claims that everyone made. And then, but these YouTube accounts, there is none of that. And this is their media. If they've switched off from mainstream media, this is what they're listening to. And it's terrifying.
Audrey, what worries you most about this?
It's this loss of trust in our institutions, particularly knowledge institutions, whether it's academia, media, and in an increasingly mediatized world where we have this deluge of information, I think it's becoming harder and harder for people to distinguish between what is true and what isn't. And I think the problem now, and we're seeing it manifested on the political level, is that we're not even talking the same language anymore. We have these bubbles that are forming online, and that's being mirrored in the offline world as well. And then when we try to have a political debate, we're not speaking the same language. It's not just that we have different political opinions. We're not even using the same information, data, and language in general. So we can't communicate with each other anymore. We've really just found ourselves now in these silos. And I think that's the most concerning part of this. And like you said as well, how do we gain back that trust? I think for a lot of people that believe in conspiracy theories, oftentimes they have almost this this vague understanding of something that's going on. So they know that on a structural level, something's off, but they don't know how to explain it. So I think conspiracy theories are a simple way of explaining things that are happening, you know, whether it's economic issues, political, cultural, social issues. But these issues are very complex, and not everyone can analyze them the way a journalist or an academic might be able to analyze them. So when they try to make sense of these things, they find the shortest route to get there.
Since it's open and anybody can say that they're linked in any way, are there central tenets, Ted, that you found as you looked at a bunch of different sites of different people who were posting in a QAnon concerned way?
Well, the one commonality I would have almost said at the beginning was it seems to be quite far right. But there's now many examples of, say, quite far left, you know, people who are associated with sort of dietary environmentalism, or very, you know, coming from an anti-government and not very trusting the government from a quite left-wing perspective. So, you know, perhaps anti-vaxxers, perhaps other sort of people who are also coming into QAnon with a big anti-government trust. It's where the terms right and left really just fall down and don't perhaps serve that much purpose in the end. I think QAnon just grabs up everything that people are scared of, and you know, any good conspiracy you can flog, that's the one that it can grab a hold of. Recently,
there's been a convergence between QAnon, flat earthers, and anti-vaxxers. And traditionally, anti-vaxxers have been, I mean, there's a lot of different, a range of political persuasions, but there's a lot of, left-wing groups now, they're converging with QAnon. And I think the only thing you can say that all these different people and claims and groups have in common is this anti-elitist, anti-authority, anti-power stance. I think that's really what unites these groups and what they're converging around.
And there's a small d democratic element to this, isn't there? That you can participate no matter where you are, in your living room, at your house, no matter where you live in the world. So if you wanted to say then, well, what's wrong with that? You know, everybody can have their own opinion, but you believe there is something wrong with this. What is wrong with QAnon, Audrey? What is dangerous about this?
Well, it's making people believe incorrect information that could potentially lead to violence. So there's definitely a violent element, but it also, I mean, there's even called like behavior. So there is a group on Reddit, for example, for family members of people that have radically changed their behavior as a result of these beliefs and conspiracies. It's really affecting families, and it's radicalizing individuals in ways that can potentially be dangerous, but that can also just harm families. It doesn't even have to be on a violent level. It's increasing this anxiety and mistrust that I think is quite dangerous at a time when we should be more measured and composed and rational more than ever to be able to confront some of the challenges we're facing.
And though, Ted, as we deal with a pandemic, as we deal with economic uncertainty, as so many people are losing their jobs, as there are racial justice issues in the United States, is it incredibly difficult for people to remain calm and thoughtful when they're facing all of these issues?
I think social media is definitely just been the fuel on the big economic social fire of the century. You know, there's World War II 70 years ago and now, but instead of our debates being thrashed out in a newspaper or by a town crier on the corner, we have our debates that are just completely slammed all over social media with little distinction between what's an authoritative source and what's not. So I think the way we have our debates, there is no doubt this is a moment in time. This is a crisis. There's a crisis going on across the world with coronavirus, but also, global inequity and global change. But the way we talk about it is completely different to the way we've dealt with our issues in the past. So I think getting back to the heart of sort of my article, which was, how far Twitter should go to regulate. I think there is definitely such a strong will for Twitter to, social media companies to take responsibility to regulate. It's just how practically much they can do. In the truth of it just appears as not much, just maybe the bare minimum to stop, as Audrey said, that outright harm, to get rid of those worst accounts. But as far as actually, getting rid of as far as actually stopping a vile conspiracy movement in its tracks, it really can't.
Yeah, and I think the issue is it's no longer about countering. It's not even a matter of countering QAnon pages or accounts. We see that some of these conspiracy theories, for example, the one in Australia about 5G towers causing the coronavirus, you might have an aunt or a family member who believes this theory without even knowing about QAnon. They might not know who QAnon is at all. They might not know anything about this phenomenon, but they've heard this idea one way or another, and they believe in it. So how do you counter that? How do you distinguish between, the reason why it's so hard countering this is because you've got content that's outright, very explicitly QAnon, and then you've got, subtle nods to QAnon, and even just people that believe the ideas have been spread by QAnon, but don't even know it's coming from QAnon.
There is so much here to unpack. And I think really the central message of what you're saying is that we need to understand the seductive power of QAnon, and we need to combat it. Thank you both very much. Ted O'Connor from Australian Broadcasting Corporation as a producer, and Audrey Cordy, Griffin University in Brisbane, a lecturer there. Thanks for joining us to talk about QAnon, and thanks for being part of this episode of Best of Both Worlds.